Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. We're just going to take another five minutes, just 2 minutes too. We'll be starting at 6:05 as we wait for everybody to come into the webinar. We have 1 minute to go. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I hope you are all keeping safe. My name is Lena Gatawaki Adeinka, and I'm your Invest2Impact 2X Connect Community Manager. Now, in this period of uncertainty, many are experiencing heightened levels of stress. How can emotional intelligence help us to maintain mental and emotional well-being? Today's webinar explores how individuals can leverage the scientific, learnable skill of emotional intelligence as a tool to thrive in this season of crisis. Through 20 years of global experience and extensive research, 6 seconds have shown that the scientifically based skills of emotional intelligence are essential for change. These skills are learnable and predict stronger effectiveness, well-being, relationships, and quality of life. This is going to be an interactive session where we practice our emotional intelligence and express our feelings on the chat line. Please type in your questions. In case you have any questions, please type in your questions on the chat line during this session so that all your questions are answered at the end of the session. I'd like to introduce our presenter, Mucha Milingo, the only 6 seconds emotional intelligence practitioner in Eastern Africa. A master facilitator and keynote speaker, Mucha utilizes the 6 seconds learning methodology and emotional intelligence model, a robust and practical tool for training and coaching in emotional intelligence, sales, customer experiences, and leadership. She believes that people are a company's most valuable asset, more valuable than the physical office, data, and capital, and is passionate about utilizing training and speaking opportunities to drive impact and cultivate a high-performance culture. Mucha, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lena, for that great introduction. Good evening, everyone. So happy to have you on board today. At the start of the year, we all had very lofty aspirations for the year ahead. However, we received this uninvited guest in the name of coronavirus. And what that's done is it has thrown our plans, our big, hairy, audacious goals into turmoil. For very many of us, we have been struggling over the last couple of months to figure out how to navigate this season that we find ourselves in. I truly believe that emotional intelligence is a crucial skill, a skill that can help us to navigate this season. And today I'm going to be talking about emotional well-being in times of crisis, and I'm really happy to have you here. As Lena mentioned, I'm hoping that we can have an interactive session, and we'll be engaging as we go along. And then at the end, we will have a Q&A where I can answer any questions that you may have. So as you've heard, my name is Mucha, and I am part of a global network called 6 Seconds. 6 Seconds is the largest emotional intelligence network globally. And we're on a mission to have 1 billion people practicing emotional intelligence. And that's because we believe that when individuals practice emotional intelligence, we have a world of insight, a world of connection, and a world of purpose, where individuals are able to achieve what they would like for their future. When you look across the globe and you see the reports that are coming along, earlier today I happened to notice a headline on CNN talking about how America has lost more people due to the coronavirus than it has in all the world wars. And I mean, those are startling statistics, right? And the reality is that we haven't seen the end of it. Here in Kenya and across the African continent, we are not really sure how this will completely play out. We're not sure if we've been spared in some of the countries, you know, in where the numbers are lesser. But the reality is that this pandemic has really changed our lives and will leave an impact forever. There are some things that we used to do that we will not be able to do ever again. And there are some ways that we conducted ourselves and conducted business that we will not be able to conduct going forward. At the same time, there are some things that have come about that are opportunities for those who are innovative and are able to grab that opportunity. And today we're just going to explore how emotional intelligence can help. So here we go. I talked about us having an interactive session. I'd like you to go to the chat box and I'd like you to type in what is the overriding emotion you have felt since the first case of COVID was announced. And for those who are joining from outside Kenya, you could just say, you know, wherever you are, how have you felt? What is the overriding emotion you have felt since, you know, COVID arrived? So if you could go to the chat box, it'd be great to hear from you. How have you been feeling? Please share.
Tina Olo is frustrated. Nebat is confused and apprehensive. Christina is anxious. Catherine is fearful, grief, anger. Barbara is very stressed, and Lucas is anxious. Nike is overwhelmed and stressed.
Thank you very much for sharing. I really appreciate it. I have had such a range of emotions, you know, from fear to anxiety to having moments where I felt completely and utterly overwhelmed and wondering how on earth I am going to navigate this season as someone who is running a small business. So I can relate to a lot of what we have been feeling. So here's the question. Considering what it is you've been feeling, and please continue to share as we're going along. I have a quotation on the screen here. Our feelings are our most genuine paths to knowledge. Our feelings are our most genuine paths to knowledge. What do you think that means? What does that say to you in relation to what it is you have been feeling? So what do you think this quotation is saying? Our feelings are our most genuine paths to knowledge. What is this saying to us? Anyone, what do you think? Our feelings are our most genuine paths to knowledge. What do you think that means? Or what does that say to you? All right, thank you so much. Yeah.
Can I read them out?
It's okay, let me do it. So Catherine's saying that we must listen to our fears if we want genuine change and enlightenment. Tina says, acknowledging how I feel will help me move forward. Thank you so much for sharing. That's very true. Anyone else would like to share? When you look at this quotation on the screen, what does it say to you in light of what it is you have been feeling? Anyone else? All right, so thank you. I think our feelings, Bernadette says, I think our feelings guide the kind of knowledge we seek. Thank you. Nebat says the best learning occurs when we are honest about how we feel. Faith says it means that my feelings, fear, help me to plan ahead in order to protect myself from getting COVID. So for example, mask, gowns, distance. Thank you. So thank you very much for sharing. Indeed, our feelings are insight. And I think one of the most important things that we can learn, and really this is at the heart of what emotional intelligence is the idea that emotions are data. Emotions are data. There are no good or bad emotions. Emotions that have traditionally made us feel uncomfortable have been labeled as bad. And traditionally, emotions that make us feel good have been, or make us, happy, have been labeled as good or positive. But the reality is there are no good or bad emotions. Emotions are data. Emotions are insight. The idea is it's your body telling you what the state of play is. It's letting you know some key information about yourself. And that information is insight that we should then use as we make the different choices and as we make the different decisions that we make. The reality is that emotions like fear, for example, tell us that something is missing, or there is a threat that something will be missing, or something will be lost. Anger tells us that there's something blocking our path going forward. This is all useful information. And so emotional intelligence starts with being aware, understanding that emotions are data. And everything that you have felt from the onset of this pandemic is insight. Everything you have felt is information that you can use as you move forward. It is information that is crucial. And so emotions are data. I'd like you to think about a time when you were your worst self. So think about a time when you were your worst self. And I'd like you to reflect on what happened inside of you. So what were your thoughts and your feelings? And what happened outside of you? So how did you act? So worst self is a time where you reacted to a situation in a way that, if you could go back in time, you would wish you could undo it. So you said something or you did something. And when you think about it right now, you cringe. You can't believe that you actually said that, or you can't believe that you did that. So I'd like you to think about a time, and don't go back far in history. In the last couple of weeks, just think about a time when you were your worst self, when your worst self reared its ugly head. And what I want you to reflect on is what happened inside of you. So what were your thoughts and your feelings? What were you thinking at that time? What did you feel at that time? And what happened outside of you? What were your actions? So I'm going to give you 30 seconds just to think about that. And I'd encourage you to have somewhere where you're going to write down stuff as we go along. So just think about that, 30 seconds, and then we'll move to the second part of this activity. So think of a time when you were your worst self. What happened inside of you? What were your thoughts? So just jot down what you were thinking. Go back to that moment in your mind. Jot down what you were feeling. Emotions come in multiples, so you can write down as many emotions you felt. And then how did you act? What happened outside of you? So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to write that down. Oh, thank you. Alice has added our feelings give us feedback to accept and move forward. Thank you very much for adding that, Alice. All right. So now that you've thought about your worst self, I'd like you to think about your best self. Think about a time when you were your best self. And the question is the same. What happened inside of you? What were your thoughts? What thoughts were running through your mind? And what were your feelings? How did you feel at that time? And then what happened outside of you? What were your actions? So think of a time when you were your best self. All right? And I'd like you to just think through, and again, write down what were your thoughts, what thoughts were running through your mind, what were your feelings, how did you feel, and what happened outside of you. So again, 30 seconds to think through that. A time when you were your best self. So this is a time where if you went back, you would, clap hands or give yourself a high five or a pat on the back because you handled a particular situation really well. So just 30 seconds to think about that. Okay. All right, so thank you so much for thinking this through. So now what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to look at the time when you were your worst self and the time when you were your best self. And I'd like you to consider what made the difference. So what made the difference between the time when you were your worst self and the time when you were your best self? And I'd like us to have a discussion about that. So anyone would like to share, and you can share on the chat. What happened, or what was the difference between your best self and your worst self? So I'll give you an example just to illustrate the point, what I'd like you to do. So I'll give you an example of instances. And when you're sharing, you don't have to tell us about what happened when you were your best self and when you were your worst self. We don't need to know what happened. What we want to concentrate on is what made the difference. So why, was there a difference in the way that you showed up? So I can give you an example. As a mother, I can say that my moments where I am my worst self and my moments where I am my best self sometimes have a lot to do with my children. So my children can bring out the worst in me and they can bring out the best in me. So if I compare an incident where my worst self showed up to an incident where my best self showed up, the difference between the two often was my self-awareness. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is I am more likely to be my worst self at times when my self-awareness is low, when I am not clued into the way that I am feeling. All right? In instances like that, I'm more likely to be my worst self. I'm more likely to be my best self when I am self-aware, when I am clued into how I'm feeling. And what I mean by that is when I know, for example, that I am so tired and exhausted, either because I've had a really long day. I was reading someone's post today and they were talking about having 9 Zoom meetings. After a day like that, when you're exhausted, your worst self is more likely to show up. So what is the difference for you? If you look at the time when you were your worst self and the time when you were your best self, what made the difference? What was the difference? And happy for someone to share or not, it's perfectly okay. The idea of this session is that it's meant to be a reflective session where we do a lot of thinking as we practice this thing called emotional intelligence. So if there's anyone who does want to share, you're welcome to. Remember, you don't have to tell us what the 2 scenarios were. What we want to know is what was the difference? What made the difference? And feel free to add in the chat box if you have anything you would like to say. All right, so Nabat says the difference is how you felt about these 2 extremes. Thank you very much for sharing that, Nabat. So your emotions impacted the way that you responded, the way that you reacted to the situation. Thank you very much, Nabat. Anyone else would like to share? What was the difference between these 2? What causes your best self to show up as opposed to your worst self? Anyone else want to share? So Faith says the difference was the person I was talking to. Okay, I was my best self when I spoke to my dad and my worst self when I spoke to a dude. Faith, I love the way you put that, a dude. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for that, Faith. So what we've heard so far is that the difference between these 2 could be the way you're feeling. The difference between these 2 could be who you're interacting with. And all of that can affect whether your best self or worst self comes up. Is there anyone else who would like to share? So Lucas says that what made the difference? Validation and a sense of accomplishment. Thank you. Lucy says the difference was knowing the source of my feelings and telling the people close to me how I feel, especially on my worst self. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. So what I'd like you to do is, if you remember, I said I'd like you to have somewhere where you can write down. I'd like you to get a piece of paper and I'd like you to divide it into 3 columns. I'd like you to divide the piece of paper into 3 columns, and the first column, so if you have a piece of paper on your, if you're right-handed, I assume it would be like on your right side. The first column, the column on the extreme left, put stop at the top of that column. The middle column, put start at the top of that column, and the third column, put continue at the top of that column. So what I'd like you to consider is going back to these 2 scenarios, one where you were your worst self and one where you were your best self. I'd like you to think about what is one thing that you need to stop doing so that more of your best self shows up. What is one thing that you need to start doing so that more of your best self shows up? And one thing you need to continue doing so that more of your best self shows up. Because the reality is when we practice emotional intelligence, our best self shows up. We may not always get it right. And the reality is that we are humans, and so there are many times that we may not get it right. But when we practice emotional intelligence, more often our best self shows up. So as we're talking about this, best self and worst self. So the first is, what do you need to stop doing? That's the first column. All right, what do you need to stop doing? So at the top of the first column, just write stop. What's one thing that you need to stop doing so that more of your best self shows up? The middle column, what's the one thing that you need to start doing so that more of your best self shows up? And what is one thing in the last column, the third column, that you need to continue doing so that more of your best self shows up? So let me illustrate what I mean. So I told you that, my example, the example that comes to mind of an incident where I was my best self and an incident where I was my worst self is in relation to my children. All right, so when I am my best self. So if I think of those 2 scenarios, one of the things that I need to stop doing is I need to stop assuming that I know what they are thinking or why they are doing what they are doing. I have 2 boys, 7 and 11. So in order for more of my best self to show up, I need to stop making assumptions about why they are doing what they're doing and what they're thinking. What do I mean by that? I need to stop assuming, for example, that they're doing what they're doing on purpose, that they're doing what they're doing in order to be disrespectful. I need to stop making that assumption, because whenever I make that assumption, it's more likely that my worst self will show up. So that's something I would put in my stop column. In my start column, right, I could say that I need to start looking at scenarios that push my buttons and commit to just pausing before I react. All right, so that's something I could put in my start column, that I am going to pause before I react so that I respond appropriately to situations that are in relation to the example I've given, which is my children. So that would go in my start. So maybe I would say count to 10, for example. And then in my continue, one of the things that I can write down for continue is I will continue focusing on self-care. One of the things I've realized is that when I am okay, I am more likely to be my best self. My best self is more likely to show up. So when I say okay, what I mean is I'm rested, so I've slept enough, I'm exercising, I'm eating well. So when I look after myself, I am better able to interact positively with my family. So one of the things that would go in my continue column would be to continue focusing on self-care. So I hope that makes it clear, right? So 3 columns, one thing that you need to stop doing so that your best self can show up, one thing you need to start doing so that your best self can show up, and one thing that you need to continue doing so that more of your best self can show up. So going back to the chat, I have some comments here on the exercise that we've been doing. So Kathleen says, worst self was freaked out by finances after the announcement that the earliest schools will open in September. Best self was when I chose to believe finances shall keep coming to pay my employees. The difference was my faith and actions. Thank you so much for sharing that. Kathleen. Worst self, Faith says, came out due to a repeated error from another party. And best self when I received a bad response, but for the first time ever. Thank you very much for sharing. All right, so Alice says, my daughter encouraged me that when the resources are, I think, are dwindling, the new ones will come. Yeah, all right, thank you. Okay, so hopefully you've had an opportunity to just have a think about these 3 columns. And we're going to come back to them because what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce you to a model that will help you to practice emotional intelligence. And we'll come back to these 3 columns so that you can add something in light of what we have learned. So in 1997, 6 Seconds, the organization I'm part of, developed a 3-part model to help people practice emotional intelligence, because it's not enough to know about it, to know about the theory. How do we actually practice? How do we actually do? And this model, as I said, has 3 parts. Know yourself, choose yourself, and give yourself. So know yourself is, what am I feeling? It's having or getting into the habit of being introspective. Very many of us operate on autopilot. The brain loves autopilot. The brain loves autopilot because it conserves energy. And the brain does a million things. So where you allow your brain to go on autopilot, the brain will do things the way you've always done them. Now, whereas autopilot is helpful for those things that don't need much thought, the reality is when it comes to our feelings, often autopilot is not helpful. What are you feeling? And it's embracing your feelings as friends, understanding that emotions are data. There's no good or bad emotions. Everything is insight, and you can use that insight to make decisions. The second part of the model, the choose yourself, is asking, what options do I have? Right? What options do I have? So, we talk about how emotions are data and it's important to get the insight. But the reality is, just because you feel a certain way doesn't mean that you should act that way. So it's understanding that, yes, I must know myself, but I then have the power to choose myself. I have the power to ask myself, what options do I have? And how can I move forward? And the last part of the model is give yourself. And give yourself really is the fuel in the engine. Give yourself is the, what do I truly want? Give yourself is the why. So why should I choose myself, for example? And I'm more likely to choose myself if I'm very clear about my why. And so this model, this 3-part model, know yourself, choose yourself, give yourself, is a circle because it's a continuous process. It's a continuous process of being more aware, of being more intentional, and of being more purposeful. More aware, more intentional, more purposeful. And when we do those 3 things, we are practicing emotional intelligence. So going back to the example of your best self and your worst self, emotional intelligence is being aware of how you're feeling in that moment. It's asking yourself, what options do I have? And the amazing thing about the brain is when we ask what options we have, the brain opens up 2 options. When we tell ourselves we have no options, the brain closes down to having no options. And all of that is driven by, what is your why? Know yourself, choose yourself, give yourself. Being more aware, being more intentional, and being more purposeful. It's understanding that your thoughts, your feelings, and your actions are all intertwined. Your thoughts affect your feelings, which affect your actions. Your actions affect your thoughts, which affect your feelings. Your actions affect your feelings, which affect your thoughts. And when we are oblivious to the way we feel, to the way we're thinking, then we are acting without thought. We are acting without realizing that our emotions impact our behavior. And that's a very dangerous way to react. And so emotional intelligence is just about being smarter with your feelings. It's understanding that these feelings are data. Fear is telling you that something is missing, or there is the potential that something will be missing. So how can you use that information? What can you do about it? When we realize that our emotions are our allies, our emotions are our friends, and we unpack what your emotions are telling you and dig a little deeper to understand why, then you're able to use that emotion. You're able to use that data as insight, and that insight is able to propel you forward. The reality is, whether you think you are a rational person or not, emotions drive behavior. That is the way the brain is wired. It's just that for some of us, emotions drive behavior very visibly and openly. We can all see it happening. And for others, emotions drive behavior underneath the surface. But emotions drive behavior. The question is, if your emotions are driving your behavior, are you aware of the direction your emotions are taking you? When you are oblivious to how you are feeling, what often happens is you think you are moving in one direction, but your emotions are taking you in another direction. And so there's this push and pull, which then results in an inability to achieve the things that we want to achieve. So I want to, because I'm mindful of my time and I need to leave time for the Q&A, I'd like to really wrap up this conversation in a way by just talking about 3 things that we can practically do. I'm very big on being practical. So we've talked about what emotional intelligence is. We've talked about how you can practice it by, making an effort to become more self-aware, making an effort to be more intentional in the things that you do, and making an effort to understand your reason why, because that's what holds it all together. But in this time of crisis, you find balance? What are some of the practical things that we can do that will help us to find balance? So the first thing is, there is so much going on and there is so much that you have little control over. And the challenge is that we have a tendency to focus on that which is the loudest. We have a tendency to focus on that which is the loudest, and what may be what may be loudest for you right now, the biggest feeling you have could be the feeling of uncertainty. And you're stuck in a space where it seems like almost everything is beyond your control. The reality is there are still some things that you do that you can control, and you can focus on that. I really love this quotation by Natalie Goldberg, that stress is an ignorant state. It believes that everything is an emergency. When we are stressed, we have a tendency to focus on the thing that is causing us the most stress. And what happens is it becomes bigger and it mushrooms until it becomes something that is overwhelming, something that you cannot possibly deal with. There are some things, there are some areas in your life where you still have some control. And so the reality is that we need to focus on that which we can control. We need to focus on the things that we can manage. When you expend energy focusing on the things that you have no control over, you're taking away energy that you could spend on things that you can control. Right? You're taking away energy that you can spend on the things that you can control. So focus on what you can control. That's the first tip that I would share. The second tip I would share is to stay connected. Research after the SARS pandemic in Hong Kong in 2008 provides evidence that individuals who were connected navigated that season better, were better able to maintain balance and emotional and mental well-being. It's really important to stay connected. We go through ups and downs and moments where you feel like, oh my goodness, I can't possibly do yet another Zoom, or your phone rings and you really just do not want to speak to another person. But it's really important to make sure that you're constantly staying in touch with your family, with your friends, finding ways that you can connect. Finding ways that you can connect. And another thing, if you know that there is someone who you think may struggle through social isolation, reach out to them. Because there are very many individuals who are struggling, who are finding themselves alone at this time, or have withdrawn from others. And yet, right now, the very thing that we need is that connectedness. So stay connected and go out of your way to reach out to those who you feel could benefit from being connected. There are so many ways, fun ways that we can remain connected, right? Fun ways, yeah, different fun ways that we can be connected. My sons and I did a challenge, and we sent videos to 10 people over a period of 10 days. So every day, day one, they sent a video on WhatsApp to one person. On day 2, it was 2 people. On day 3, it was 3 people, all the way to day 10. So on day 10, we did 10 different videos. And I mean, they were really simple videos, just, hi, how are you, putting faces. And everyone we sent a video to, and coincidentally, they picked my sister-in-law as the first person. So she got the most videos because she got a video every day for 10 days. And I mean, she just loved the videos. So find fun ways that you can connect, you can engage, so that you don't withdraw and become too inward facing, because that can make it more difficult for us to navigate this season. The third tip I want to share before I end and open up for questions is we need to practice optimism. Work done by Martin Seligman. Martin Seligman conducted some research and looked at the idea of optimism. Optimism has always been considered, or had always been considered, as something that's a trait. That means it's fixed. So you're either optimistic or you're pessimistic. But the research that he conducted shows that optimism actually is a skill, which means it can be learned. So you may have a predilection towards pessimism, which means that you may default to seeing the glasses as half empty. But it's a skill, right? So regardless of where you start, you have control over the skill and how you can exercise it. And so one of the ways we can exercise optimism is by reminding ourselves of 3 key things. Number 1 is permanence. This will not last forever. This will not last forever. It may seem like it's never ending, but the reality is that this will not last forever. This is probably the most difficult thing to consider because it feels like we've been going through this forever. But the reality is it will not last forever. And at some point, it will come to an end. At some point, life will find some new balance. Maybe not the way it was, but life will find some new balance. So the first way we practice optimism is by reminding ourselves that this will not last forever. Permanence. The second way we practice optimism is this idea of pervasiveness. This is not changing everything. When we have a pessimistic outlook on situations, we begin to feel that this situation defines everything and has encompassed everything. So there's this feeling of it being pervasive. And it may be hard to consider the fact that it's not pervasive because it does seem like this pandemic touches every single part of our lives. And so it may be difficult to think that there are parts of your life that haven't been touched, but the reality is we must remember to express gratitude for what we do have, even in these difficult times, and for the choices that you can make to focus on what you can control, to focus on your and others' well-being, to focus on spending quality time with your family, to focus on maybe going back to the drawing board for your business and thinking through how your business will navigate or will pivot, how you can try out some of those things that you've been meaning to try out. And the third way that we practice optimism is reminding ourselves is that the situation we find ourselves in is effort possible, that there's this idea of personalization. And what that means is that the effort you make will yield results. And it may seem as though you're making no movement, but I'm convinced that when we look back over this period, there are there are individuals who will look back and will be amazed at the steps forward that they took. And yet at the time, it seemed like there was hardly any movement. So we practice optimism by reminding ourselves of permanence. This will not last forever. We practice optimism by reminding ourselves of pervasiveness. This is not changing everything. And we practice optimism by reminding ourselves of personalization. Your effort will make a difference. The minute steps you take today will make a difference. And so these are three things that I wanted to share that would help us to really find balance in this time. And I hope that you found them helpful. Lena, I've come to the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to open up for any questions. I see there are some questions already. So I'm happy to take any questions that individuals may have at this time.
Okay, would you like to read out the questions, or should I read them out?
Yes, no, I can see it, that's all right. So Alice says, how can I keep the good feelings when we are always attacked by bad feelings during the process of improving myself? I think, Alice, the first thing is remembering that feelings are insight. So those feelings that you are looking at as bad are actually giving you insight, they're giving you information. So what we need to do is develop the habit of unpacking what that negative feeling or what that feeling that we have ascribed as negative is trying to tell us. So if it's fear, what is that fear trying to tell you? If it's feeling overwhelmed, what is that feeling of being overwhelmed trying to tell you? We have a saying that if you name it, you can tame it. A lot of times the reason why emotions keep overwhelming us is because when they surface, we do everything possible to avoid them, to push them away, to shove them in a box. But our emotions are there for a reason. So what we should do instead, I like to imagine my emotions are a friend who's come round for tea, and we're sitting at the table drinking tea, and my emotion is giving me insight. And you will be amazed at the power of thinking of your emotion as an ally, as opposed to thinking of your emotion as an enemy. When you think of your emotion as an ally and you ask yourself, what is this emotion trying to tell me? Why am I afraid? What is it that I am afraid of? Just dig deeper. Rather than brushing it off at the surface, dig deeper. You will find that the emotions that make us feel uncomfortable are actually the emotions that can potentially propel us so much more forward than the emotions that make us feel good. So those emotions that you feel are bad, unpack them. Ask yourself why. Dig a little deeper. Why are you feeling that way? Why else are you feeling that way? What else are you feeling? And when we practice being uncomfortable, being comfortable with being uncomfortable, we learn amazing insights about ourselves. And we're able to then push ourselves outside of our comfort zone. So I think that is the key thing. At the end of the day, just really unpack those emotions. Don't say, this is good, I'm going to embrace it, this is bad, I'm going to ignore it or suppress it. No, all of them, take them, unpack them, dig a little deeper. Why are you feeling that way? What else are you feeling? Okay, let's go to another layer. Why do you feel that way? What else do you feel? And when we unpack, you will find that there are some hidden gems, even in those emotions that make us feel uncomfortable. Last week, we had our EQ Cafe, and we're talking about uncertainty. And research conducted shows that uncertainty actually has the power to push us outside of our comfort zone. So these emotions that we feel are negative actually are able to help us move forward. That said, if we find ourselves in a place where you are completely overwhelmed and potentially you're now moving into the realm of feeling depressed, then I would encourage that we always reach out and get help for that. But typically our emotions are insight. It's data giving you information. I'm working extra hard to remain in the positive space currently. Hope there won't be a version of burnout at the end of COVID. Lucas, I actually think there will be. I think that the hard part is actually coming. I believe that Very many of us have either kept ourselves busy, we've gone back to the drawing board. For those of us in business, we've thought up new ways to navigate. We're trying to figure out how do we survive. So we're busy. But the reality is that when life goes back to the new normal, whatever that may be, we're going to have to move forward having dealt with this emotional turmoil. And very many of us don't know how to process emotional turmoil because we've never really thought that it's important to consider how we feel. But the reality is our emotions drive our behavior. So I feel that, the work is going to have to continue. It's not going to just stop with, with when things go back to whatever normal will look like. As a matter of fact, we have a conference that we are hosting on the 2nd of July, and we're going to be talking about that, so what happens next, life after COVID. We've gone back to work, your employees are back, but they've gone through this thing that they've gone through. So how do we help people to find emotional balance even after? So I think that there is a chance, Lucas, that there will be some sort of emotional burnout. And the way that we can circumvent that, the way that we can prepare ourselves for that, is to start practicing these simple emotional intelligence, this emotional intelligence skill. And one of those is just being self-aware. It's just getting into the habit of truly connecting with ourselves so that we can truly understand how we feel. Because if you are on autopilot, by the time you realize you are emotionally burnt out, it's when you've crashed, right? But if you are self-aware, you see the signs coming that, okay, you know what? I'm not in a good space at this time. And then you're able to think through what you can do to help you navigate. And I think these are conversations we're going to have once we're kind of back and you're working, especially those who lead teams. Once you're working with your teams, I think you're going to have to now think of how you will have regular conversations about emotional and mental well-being. This is not something that will end with the end of COVID. I mean, COVID's not going away, but you know what I mean by the end. I think that we really need to practice. Okay, I'm not sure if there's any other question. Lena, is there a question of left out? I'm not seeing any other questions. Okay, so how can you participate in the conference? Let me share the link. You can register online.
Okay.
If you just go to our website, eq4africa.com, you'll find all the details for the website.
Okay.
We're really excited. Because it's online, it means that we have no limitation when it comes to speakers. So we have some really amazing speakers lined up. And we're going to spend half a day just talking about emotional intelligence and why it's going to be important. The reality, guys, is this. If emotional intelligence ever was a nice to have, it is no longer the case. It is now a necessary skill to be able to navigate. In their report some years ago, the World Economic Forum listed emotional intelligence as one of the key skills for 2020. Little did they know that it literally would be for 2020. I mean, they were talking about the future of work. But I truly believe that to navigate this season we find ourselves in and the season beyond, we're going to have to dig deeper and learn how to use our emotions, to gain that insight from our emotions and to utilize how our emotions can propel us forward. And individuals who don't will find that they are moving forward, but their emotions are taking them backwards. So the only way to really thrive is to figure out how you can use the skill of EQ. And what's exciting about it is that it's a skill, right? So that means that anyone and everyone can practice emotional intelligence. It doesn't matter where your level of emotional intelligence has been. If you are intentional, you can learn how to be more emotionally intelligent. And the tip I would give, if you're thinking, okay, so this is great to know, where do I start? The tip I would give you is start with self-awareness. Start with getting into the habit of understanding how you feel and why you feel that way. If you did a quick survey and you asked, and you can try this after this webinar, I'm assuming you're home. So if you're home, just ask your family members. If you ask people, how are you feeling? I can assure you, you will not get, in most families, you will not get more than 2 to 3 responses in terms of the range of feedback. And often those are good, bad, fine, okay. The reality is that we have not really been taught how to see our emotions as a key resource and to be able to actually call out what it is that we are feeling. So if you're looking for where to start with developing self-awareness. Remember, the model said, know yourself, choose yourself, give yourself. Start with self-awareness. Commit to spending time just being introspective, asking yourself how you are feeling and why you are feeling that way. The more we stop being on autopilot, the more we are able to use that information as insight for us. There's another question here. How do we practice EQ over digital interactions now that all life is digital, schoolwork, e-commerce? That's a really interesting question. And actually, about 2 weeks ago, I attended a webinar from an individual who was talking about, our humanness online. I think that, so if I look at that question and approach it from different directions, I think where you're leading a team, for example, it's really important that if you are leading a team that you provide a way that the team can decompress. If you think about how we work in the office, often there is, what's called the water cooler, where people gather around and catch up and with each other and socialize. And now that people are working remotely, that doesn't exist. So I would say, number one, if you're leading teams, you find a way to set up a virtual water cooler, a space where people can just decompress and just share, and it's not the usual official channels. So a great example of this is having a social WhatsApp group. Every company has probably a WhatsApp group. Every team probably has a WhatsApp group, but the official WhatsApp group isn't necessarily the place for people to decompress. So you could have, for this season of COVID, especially where you're leading remote teams, you could have a fun WhatsApp group where people are able to share and just decompress and catch up and laugh together. There's a gentleman who attended one of our sessions before who mentioned that for them, they have a Friday drink up. So people log on to Zoom, everyone has their own drink, and they catch up that way. So find ways, I think that's the first thing, especially where you're leading a team, to make sure that you do connect, right? And that you leave the door open at least to be able to interact with members of your team. Where it's, and I think the same thing applies even if it's family. So for all interactions, find ways across the digital. From a business perspective, I truly believe that now is the time more than ever for businesses to show their humanness. What is it that you're doing for your customers that's going over and beyond to show them your human side? How are you connecting with your key customers to truly understand how they are finding this season and how you can support them, even if they are not buying from you, right? So even if your customers aren't currently buying from you, how are you supporting them at this time? How are you reaching out? And there's so many ways that you can reach out to your customers so that they're aware or they see your humanness, a way that you can connect with them. So I think that's what I'd say, Lucy, that number one, if you're leading teams, make sure that there is an opportunity to connect. That way, and unfortunately right now, the only way you can connect is digital. But if you make it unofficial, if you make it like a social that you're doing, then you're using digital in a way to kind of socially connect. And then when it's your business reaching out to your customers, I would say that you must have a strategy right now where you are supporting your clients, that you are reaching out to them and you are showing the human side of your business, looking at how you can support them. And that then helps you to show your humanness. So thank you for that question. Daria says, thank you so much. This will help me. I have realized a lot of my bad behavior was due to my emotions. So this webinar has made a big change in me. Thank you so much for that comment. Our emotions drive our behavior. Guys, I cannot emphasize that enough. And there are very many individuals who will argue, no, I'm very rational. My emotions don't impact me in any way. the reality is, whether you see it or not, your emotions do impact your behavior. And so when we are aware of how we are feeling, we're able to then utilize that to navigate life effectively. Okay, so what's a better question to ask other than how are you when you want to know how someone is really feeling? So I think for check-ins, how are you feeling? Often people don't share. So one of the things that I do, and this I do with my team, and I also do with my family, is we talk about highlights and lowlights, or roses and thorns. So, a good way to know how someone is feeling is asking them, so what were your highlights today? Or your highlights today? And they can tell you, oh my gosh, this happened and it was really exciting. And then they start sharing a bit more. Or what were your lowlights, right? So what was the lowest part of your day today? Because when we start sharing about our lowlights, we start sharing about the way we were feeling about those lowlights. And when someone starts sharing, you can then probe a little more. It's very similar to the roses and thorns idea. So, it's talking about what were today's roses. So your roses are the highlights, and what were today's thorns. All right, so your thorns are the lowlights. And, when you're sharing, many of us have a tendency when we reach out and ask people how they're feeling to want to jump in and fix it. I think another thing, Jane, I would say is when you're trying to connect and trying to get to how someone is doing and how someone is feeling, it's really important that you don't immediately then jump in to try and solve it. That you just are creating that space so someone can just share. And then you can ask them that, when as they share, if they want you to do something about it. But a lot of times, someone just wants a listening ear. So I think that's what I would say, Jane. It's, so tell me, what's your biggest highlight today? Or if it's someone that you're interacting with and you haven't spoken that week, what's your biggest highlight this week? And then when you ask that question, it opens up the opportunity to probe a little deeper. Or what was, your low light? So in our house, it's highlights and lowlights. So I hope that's answered the question. Lena, I think that's the last of the questions I have here.
Yes. Thank you, Mucha.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think I'm feeling much better. I think we all are feeling much better. We've taken a deep breath. And thank you for that enlightening presentation.
Thank you.
Now, on 17th June, Fasil Bebre Sadiq will be hosting a webinar on access to finance in a COVID-19 world at 6 p.m. And on 20th June, the second session on our social media webinar will be hosted by Christina Angel Anderson from 6 p.m. For those of you who want to review these recordings, they'll be on the file section on the 2X Connect platform. And we also want to invite you to join our new 2X Connect social media community. This is a forum that is focused on supporting you and your needs while you develop your business in the online space. Ladies, we look forward to meeting Mucha again. Thank you, Mucha, once again. And I look forward to meeting you in the next webinar. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.